Another side. We refer to an article entitled Wisdom and Worship in an issue of the Brahmavadin dated the 5th of June, 1897. The first paragraph is devoted to the statement and exposition of the two postulates of existence, according to the Shankyas, namely nature and souls, and the next paragraph shows how untenable this theory is in the view of the Vedantin, and the article proceeds in its first half to expound the view of the Vedantin on the same subject. As the article deals with some of the most fundamental questions connected with Hindu philosophy, we proceed today to examine some of these statements contained in the first part of the article only, leaving the question of worship to be discussed hereafter. According to Shankya, there is nature, pradhana, which changes and manifests all phenomena, and there are an infinite number of souls, which being simple cannot change, and must therefore be different from nature. Nature works out all phenomena for the liberation of the soul, and liberation consists in the soul discriminating that it is not nature, pradhana. The soul is omnipresent also. The Vedantin answers that this is not a perfect system. If nature is simple, and the soul is also simple, there will be two simples, and the soul being omnipotent, nature must be omnipresent also, and then nature will be beyond time, space, and all causation, and no change is possible as such in nature. There is thus an impossibility of having two simples and two absolutes. How does the Vedantin solve this problem? His solution is this. Because according to the Shankyan, there must be a soul apart from nature, for the reason that nature in all her modifications, from gross matter up to chitta, or the intellect, is simply insentient, even the mind stuff being insentient. So there must be some sentient being as the motive power behind nature, making the mind think and nature work. Now, says the Vedantin, this sentient being, which is behind the whole universe, is what we call God, and consequently this universe is not wholly, the italics are ours, different or apart from him. It is but himself who has somehow, the italics are ours, become this universe. He is not only the instrumental cause of the universe, but also the material cause thereof. A cause is never altogether different from its effect, and an effect is but its own cause reproduced in another form. All Vedantins accept these propositions, it is stated, namely first, that God is both the instrumental and material cause of this universe, and that everything exists is He, and secondly, that souls are also part of God, sparks of that infinite fire, and an Upanishad text is quoted in proof of this. No, it is said further down, it is no spark, but the burning log itself, inasmuch as Brahman can have no parts. Then how can there be so many souls? We are led into another simile, the oft-repeated simile of the sun and its myriad reflections in different particles of water. So all these souls are but reflections of Brahman, and are not real. They are not the real I. The one undivided being, men, women, brutes, are mere reflections of him, and are unreal. There is but one infinite being, and he appears as you and me, and the appearance of distinctions is all a delusion. This apparent division of him is caused by looking at him through the network of time and space and causation. The ego is he, the non-ego is he. They are not part of him, but the whole of him. It is the eternal knower who stands behind all phenomena. He himself is the phenomena. He is both the subject and object. He is the ego and the non-ego. Here we might pause before we proceed to the rest of the paragraphs. In the first place, we must beg leave to state that the criticism of the Shankya proceeds on a mere word quibble. The word that is translated simple is, we believe, avyaktam, that source of fruitful dispute between a number of learned heads like the late Mr. T. Subba Rao, the Light of the East, the Thinker, and the Brahmavadin itself, etc., etc., i.e., where the word occurs in the Gita. The whole mistake is, no doubt, due to no remembering that this word and others like prana, purusha, atma, kshetra, etc. are used in the older works in a number of acceptations, and any argument based on such a verbal semblance is sure to end in fatal error. Now, in regard to this word, avyatka, it is used in the 10th Sutra of the Shankhyakarika to distinguish Mulaprakriti from its own products, and the commentator no doubt says that the distinction might apply to the soul also. The word might itself be applied to the soul, but then it only means uncaused and causeless, and Colebrook translated as undiscrete. The third sutra makes clear this distinction in the very beginning. Nature is no production. 7 principles are productions and productive. 16 are productions, unproductive. The soul is neither a production nor productive. Herein lies all the difference between the soul as avyatka and nature, pradana as avyatka, and the mental and sensory planes. Nature itself occupies a higher position, is more pervasive than the intellect, and intellect is more pervasive than the senses, and so on. That is to say, intellect is omnipresent, and senses are not, when in relation to the senses themselves. But intellect is not, when in relation to pradana, and pradana is omnipresent so far as regards its own productions, but its omnipresence is nothing when in the presence of the soul, since the latter is the superintendent, the enjoyer, and the former ceases to exist when the soul is in a state of abstraction. As such, the word omnipresence itself is a relative term, as space itself is, and it is absurd to conclude that since both are called simple and omnipresent, ergo they must be two absolutes, and two such impossible things. We will explain ourselves more fully. Take, for instance, the 5 senses, the eye, the ear, etc. The eye covers a certain sphere in its operation, but it is limited. It cannot comprehend what the ear can perceive, and the ear cannot do what the nose can feel, and so on. Each sense, in fact, is limited and unpervasive. But take the intellect in connection with this. The intellect is omnipresent. It both sees and hears and smells, etc. It covers a greater sphere, and all the spheres covered by its own productions, the senses. But take the intellect, buddhi itself, in its relation to the soul. The soul is sentient, and buddhi is insentient. The latter is nowhere when the soul is in itself. As such, the soul is more really omnipresent than pradana or nature. That is to say, there are different planes of existence and different grades of vyapaka vyapya. The one lowest is vyapya, and the other higher is vyapaka, and this higher itself is vyapya when compared with something higher than itself, and so on, till we arrive at a being who is most omnipresent and beyond wisdom our thought and mind cannot penetrate. This view of the Shankhyan has no doubt not presented itself to the Vedantin, and what the latter has, however, in his mind is the old riddle, how can two things coexist and one be omnipresent? Like all such riddles, this is based on a fallacy in not taking note of the facts above presented about the essential difference between pradana and the soul. The riddle supposes that two things are of the same kind, of the same quantity, length, breadth, width, and of the same density and tenuity, etc. If they are so, no doubt it will be an impossibility, but we contend that things of different densities and tenuities can fill and overlap one over the other, and much more so when one is sentient and chit, and the other is non-sentient and achit. For instance, there can be no two things so contrary in nature as light and darkness. And do they coexist or not, or are they one and the same? To the objection of the Vedantin, that darkness is no padartha, we have only to instance the recent discoveries of our own Hindu scientist, I mean Dr. Bose, who could demonstrate the presence of invisible rays of light in a pitch-dark room by means of his instrument. What does this mean? The ray of light has been so thin as to be swallowed up in the grosser darkness. When a lamp is brought, it could dispel the darkness itself, but only within a certain radius. Then a bigger light, a gas light, an electric light of a vast number of candle powers, but all these pale away more the brilliant light of the sun. There is thus such a merger of one, the less powerful, in one more tenuous. Are not all these summed up in the simple sentence, Nach chich chitsanidao? In the presence of the Sat, everything else is sunyam, non-existent, non-apparent. Saint Makanda Deva adds, As before the perfect and eternal intelligence, the imperfect and acquired intelligence, falsehood, is shorn of its light, it is therefore established that in the presence of the Sat, Asat loses its light. And the illustration implied in this is amplified in the following verse. Evil, Asat, ceases to exist before him, as does darkness before the sun. The term Asat has itself been the parent of many misconceptions, in the East and in the West, and different interpreters of Shankara explain it in different ways. Here is what a critic of Paul Deussen says. Kant is mostly credited with having proved that there is something behind or beneath the reality of our senses, which these cannot fathom. The European scientists say sneeringly, "What of that? If we cannot get at it, let us ignore it." And on the other hand, the Neo-Kantian metaphysicians say, "No, this is the only reality. Therefore all the rest is useless rubbish, only fit for momentary amusement, and this is all." That is the Western conception of the Indian term Maya Asat, indeed a rubbish conception, and mistaken by this illusion, Western philosophers have declared that Eastern philosophy, and particularly Vedantism and Buddhism, are acosmism, i.e., they deny the existence of the universe altogether. An incredible absurdity. Is not the real meaning of Shankara easy enough to understand? Everyone knows that there are different states of consciousness. That of an animal is different from that of a man, that of a savage different from that of a savant, that of a waking man different from that of a dreaming man, and all these are different from that of a sage in samadhi. Now, it is a matter of course that reality of a waking man is different from that reality which he conceives as such when he is dreaming, and both are very different from that reality, or those different states of reality, of which he becomes conscious when he enters Shushupti and Turiya, and all these are again other realities than that as which the Mukta realizes Atman. Viewed from the standpoint of any of these different states of consciousness, all the other conceptions of reality appear as Maya, as illusion, or as unreal. The material scientist, together with most European philosophers, would even not hesitate a minute to declare the alleged realization of Atman an illusion, although he would not deny that this might be some state of consciousness. And, by the way, he objects to translating avidya as ignorance or nescience, but as not vidya, or not yet wise, or other than wise. That is, asat does not mean non-existent, but not sat, or other than sat. This is Shankara's view according to Dr. Hübschleiden, and this is the view we have taken trouble to expound above, and yet how many followers of Shankara hesitate before reading Maya as illusion and delusion, and avidya as ignorance and nescience? In the very article under review, we read in one sentence that each soul is a spark, a part. In the next sentence, no, it is not a part, but the whole of Brahman. In the very next sentence, all these souls are but reflections of Brahman, and are not real. Men, women, and animals, etc., are but reflections of him, and are unreal in themselves. If they are mere reflections, and unreal, how is it reconcilable with the statement that each soul is not even a part, but the whole of Brahman? The whole argument is made up by the use of similes, and by not sticking to one, but by jumping from one into another, to meet the difficulty arising in the former. Either the argument must proceed on simple facts and inferences, and without the use of similes, or, when it is attempted to be proved solely from figures, then no apology should be presented, that it is only a figure, and it should not be strained. The simile was expressly used for demonstrating to the ignorant how the thing is possible and conceivable, and when the ignorant man, following the simile, asks if the same antecedents are present in the thing compared, to warrant the conclusion, what answer does the Vedantin give him? This apparent division of him as you and me and the dog is caused by looking at him through the network of time, space, and causality. Looking at him indeed, when, and by whom? How is this looking at him, and this delusion possible before the actual division itself? The operation of the division of him into you and me and animal must precede the operation of you and me, etc., looking upon each other and him delusively. Does the delusion come in before the evolution of Brahman into you and me an animal, or after such evolution. To any thinking being, it must occur that this delusion must have occurred before and not after, and the Brahmavadin sees this and states below that there will be in the universe a final duality, Atman and delusion. Mark here and elsewhere the word delusion is simply used as a synonym for Maya, and this objection is brushed aside on the ground that delusion is no existence, and that to call it otherwise is idle sophistry. And yet you and me and others were all this while under a delusion. Were we or were we not? Is that a fact or a delusion itself? Is the evolution of God into men, women, and animals, is that a fact or not? If a fact is the question, how is this evolution brought about, a possible question or an impossible question? If not a fact, why is the statement made in another paragraph that there are perfect men and imperfect men, men like Christ, Buddha, and Krishna, who have to be worshipped, and men like others who have to worship them? This evolution of God into man and animals is put in one place on a possible and rational basis, in that God wants to know himself, wants to see himself, and realize himself by means of his reflections. Why and wherefore it is not stated, inasmuch he cannot know and see himself otherwise, in the same way as we on earth cannot see our face except in a mirror. Again we ask, is the distinction between a perfect man and an imperfect man real or not? And does our learned brother contemplate the possibility of seeing his beautiful face distorted in a mirror? Whose fault was this? It was our brother's fault in not choosing a good mirror. And does he mean to attribute to the most intelligent such fault in not choosing such a vessel in which he can see himself and know himself to the best advantage? The perfect cannot seek to know himself in the imperfect and the ignorant, the wicked and the sinful, the sorrowing and the suffering. If all this is a play of his, and no such distinction as the imperfect, the wicked and the sinful, and the sorrowing and the suffering exists, and all this is a hallucination, myth, non-existence, we use his own choice words, why should any man aspire to be a good man, a perfect man, a jivanmukta? Why should he realize his identity with the Absolute? God, in trying to realize himself, for his sport or for what, became man and woman and brute. And look at the bother of this man, woman, or brute, doing good acts without attachment, real tapas, yoga, and jnana, to realize his identity with the Absolute. What guarantee is there that, after all this bother, a jivan mukta may not again be differentiated from the Absolute into a man, woman, or animal? How senseless and vain all these efforts seem! How ignoble the purpose of creation and evolution! To the question, why does the perfect become the imperfect, which question or brother states in all its various forms, vulgar and highly philosophic, our brother's answer is that this question is an impossible one, and it should not be put at all. We have already pointed out how inconsequential this question and answer is, but the same question has been put in and answers attempted by learned men who are of our brother's ilk, and these answers are various and conflicting in themselves. Of these, Swami Vivekananda gets most glory. His answer is, I do not know. Mr. Mukhopadhyaya replies that the Swami is wrong, and that the perfect does not become the imperfect. God does not become man. Man is only a reflection, and as such cannot be God. According to the Brahmavadin, man as a reflection is unreal, but the unreality itself is unreal, and as such man is God. And so no question arises of the perfect and the imperfect. According to Paul Deussen, the answer is, the never-ceasing new creation of the world is a moral necessity, connected with the doctrine of samsara. A moral necessity for Atman? What a contradictio in adjecto, exclaims his critic. Atman, as we all agree, is that which is beyond all necessity and causality. That is, causality reigns or exists only in our manifested world of individual consciousness of any sort. And the critic's own explanation is that existence is the manifestation of the will to exist, and this will is Trishnatana, the desire for enjoyment. Well, whose will, we ask? Who desires for enjoyment? The Absolute, the Satchidananda, or any other? What call this hell and earth and enjoyment for him? We leave our learned doctor to fight out Professor Deussen by himself, and proceed to state another learned lady's opinion. If we remember correctly, she said, Ishvara evolves into man and brute to gather experience, to improve himself by means of his animal sheaths, and that there could be no perfect Brahman at any time. It goes on improving itself day by day. That if the Veda repeats the cry that there is a bourne from which there is no return, it is a mere make-believe. And all these are learned expounders of Shankara's school, and who is right? Can we ask this question, or is our question captious? The Siddhantin's answer is the question itself is based on a fallacy, an assumption. The fact assumed is that the perfect becomes the imperfect. Is this a fact proved? Does God really become man and brute? What is the proof of this, let alone Vedic texts and the desire to reach a high-sounding philosophic unity? It is this fancied desire to generalize everything into one that led the Greek philosophers to postulate number and water and fire as the final and ultimate cause of all things. Why not leave bad, good, and evil as they are? Why should you refer the evil to the good, impure to the pure? Will not silence in this respect be golden? Will not manam in this case be real jnanam? Well, we will here go back to our statement of what the Shankyan meant when he postulated a pradana and a soul or souls. The learned editor of The Light of the East has evidently fallen into an error when, in his account of the ancient Shankya system, he opines that according to the ancient Shankya and the Gita, there is only one Purusha and not many Purushas. The mistake is due to the fact that in the enumeration of the Padarthas, the singular only is used, a mere technical usage, as in the phrases Jiva Ishvara Jagat, Chit Achit Ishvara, Pati Pashu Pasha. All the words used are in the singular, and it cannot mean that the respective schools mean to postulate only one jiva, one chit, or one pasha. In explaining each, the explanation will be given that the jiva or souls are many. In the same way, in the earlier sutras of the Shankya, Purusha in the singular is used, but the subsequent sutras proceed to state that the Purushas are multitudinous. Pradana is real, and it is the cause, and its effects. The phenomena are also real, as the effect subsists already in the cause, and as our learned brother approvingly puts it, an effect is its own cause, reproduced in another form. And we hope the following sentence from Dr. Brown's lectures will equally meet with our brother's approval. That the form of the body is only another name for the relative position of the parts that constitute it, and that the forms of the body are nothing but the body itself. If so, why should the cause be considered real and the effect unreal, as against the view of Shankyan by Vedantins? If the Maya is phenomenon and effect, why should it be unreal when the substance and cause is real? The relation of cause and effect has, however, to be kept separate from the relation of substance and phenomenon, and these two from the questions of reality and delusion. In the second paragraph, however, our brother identifies the Shankyan's pradana with his own Maya, and the Shankyan's Purusha with his own God, or Brahman. If so, why attempt any criticism of the Shankya? It is all a quibble about words. They practically postulate the same and mean the same things. Then why is it that the Shankya is called by Shankara Nirishvara Shankya, godless or atheistic Shankya, and the philosophy of the Gita as Sheshvara Shankya, or the theistic Shankya? The word Shankya, meaning primarily number, meant with Kapila and Krishna, a theory or philosophy. Compare, for instance, a similar change in the Tamil word meaning number, and in the verse meaning logic and philosophy. The following quotation from the Gita itself will explain the difference between the two schools. There are two Purushas in this world, one destructible and the other indestructible. The destructible is Sharvabhutani, all things. The indestructible is called the Kutashta, chapter 15:16. Well, look how this verse runs. It mentions only two Purushas instead of mentioning three, as arising from the next verse. But there is a purpose in so mentioning two Purushas. It is seemingly to reiterate the accepted postulate of the Purvapaksha school, to enable it to state the Siddhanta view in the next verse, which is, the Paramapurusha is verily another, declared as the Paramatman, he who pervades and sustaineth the three worlds, the indestructible Ishvara. Consider again the steps that follow one upon another in the next verse. Since I excel the destructible first Purusha and am more excellent than the indestructible second Purusha, in the world and in the Veda I am proclaimed Purushottama, third Purusha. Be it noted here that the word Purusha simply means a category, a padartha, as when we speak of Tripadartha or Tattvatrayam. Note again how in verse 19, chapter 13, the first two Purushas are mentioned as by its more appropriate names, Prakriti and Purusha, and the same definition of these two is given in verses 20 and 21 as by the Shankya, and a further step beyond Kapila is taken by Sri Krishna in postulating a spectator and permitter, supporter and enjoyer. Maheshvara thus is styled the Paramatman, in this body the Paramapurusha. And then a most beautiful passage about the distinction of these three padarthas and of the different jnanas, Pashajnana, Pashujnana, and Patijnana occurs. The Lokayata only knows his body and has no knowledge of his own self or anything higher. According to the Nirishvara Shankyan or the Vedantin, there are or seem to exist only two things, Prakriti and soul, Maya and Atman, and liberation consists in distinguishing his own self as different from a Prakriti or Maya, delusions. This is Pashujnana or Atmajnana. According to the Shashvara Shankyan, he sees and learns to distinguish Prakriti from his self, and his self from the highest one, verse 29, as Akarta and Karta, and knowing the nature of this one, he reaches Brahmanhood, verse 30 of chapter 13. It is also to be remarked particularly that in the whole Gita, in innumerable passages, as in the one cited above, the knowledge of the Supreme, the devotion wholly to Him, is put forward as the highest path of attaining liberation, and not the Atmajnana doctrine that the knowledge of the individual self, as implied in the phrase, know thyself, is the highest attainment. We beg leave again to quote Dr. Huber Schleiden, simply to know how this latter theory is repugnant to the followers of Shankara. Indeed, there can be no more fatal error than to believe with those furthest advanced Western philosophers that jnanam or moksha means nothing else but the intellectual conception, monism, Advaita, nothing else but the intellectual enjoyment of a proud theory. What we have said till now will convince our readers that there is another side to these questions, and that they do not stand alone where the Shankyans and the Vedantins left them. According to this view, the Shankyans are correct, no doubt, so far as they go, in postulating Prakriti and Purusha, and the Vedantin is quite correct in his identification of these two with his Maya and Brahman. There is but a thin partition between the soul or man of the Shankya and the latter's Brahman. In fact, man is God. In such identification of man with God, what results is that man's intelligence does not pass on to the postulating and realizing of a higher being than himself, and the Brahman of the Vedantin is only so in name. The third school postulates this third Padartha, differing from the soul or Atman of either school, whom the latter cannot know except with the grace of the third Padartha, and, though it might be correct to say that man cannot know himself, it will be blasphemous to say that God cannot know himself. This will be attributing a human imperfection to the Most High, and to limit his nature. How do we know that he cannot know himself, when we cannot know our own selves, nor him without his grace? Consider the following passage from Saint Mikandadeva. When the soul unites itself to God and feels his aro, love, God covers it with his supreme bliss and becomes one with it. Will he not know himself, who is understood by the soul through the intelligence of the soul? The next passage we are going to quote will show clearly that God has not manifested his glorious truth to one people and in one clime alone. Why may not the Absolute be self-conscious, asks a Christian divine in almost the same words. To deny this to him would be to deny to him one of the perfections which even finite beings may have. The question remains, what then is the necessity for all this evolution and resolution? The answer is contained in a simple sentence in the first sutra of Shivajnana Bodham. The second padartha in our categories and not the third is imperfect, or more correctly is shrouded by dross, which has to be removed like the colors on a crystal, so that its own pristine purity may be apparent, and it can reflect and realize the glory and presence of God in all its brightest effulgence. This existence and resolution is due to the will of this lower being, Atman, to perfect itself, and the will of the highest comes into play, to enable the soul to work out its own salvation. The Ichcha, Jnana, and Kriya Shaktis of the Lord induces the Ichcha, Jnana, and Kriya Shaktis of the individual soul, and herein is God's grace and love and omnipotence manifested. The exercise of the divine will is not for enabling itself to exist free from samsara, not for perfecting itself, not for knowing, seeing, or realizing itself, not for its sport or pleasure, not for no purpose, but it is simply to help and aid the poor soul in its attempt to effect all these things. How well does our Saint Tayamanavar realize this conception of God's great beneficence? This view postulates three padarthas, and it may be called dualism or dvaita, or anything of the sort. But how this view is the strict Advaita also, true monism, will be demonstrated in a future article. The Tattvas and beyond. God is not this, not this. Birad Avidya Upanishad. Other than the known is God, other than the unknown too. Svetasvara Upanishad. We present our readers today a table of the 36 tattvas derived from Maya, together with the other postulates of the Siddhanta school, with which they are connected in Advaita relation. In Tamil, small tracts called Kathalai exist, which describe and define these tattvas. These tattvas are variously enumerated as 19 or 25, or 36 or 96. Both Siddhantins and Vedantins, idealists, accept the number 36 or 96, but they differ in several particulars. 36, when still more analyzed, give 96. The more simpler form of the table is herein given, and this requires to be carefully studied. A careful and precise definition of these tattvas has to follow, but we do not attempt it here for want of space. Reverend Hoisington has translated one of these tracts, as also Reverend Folks of Salem. Both these books unfortunately are out of print. We will proceed to explain the table briefly, stating at the same time its points of difference from other schools. We have to premise first that the tattvas which are enumerated here are all produced out of and form subdivisions only of Maya, and the term as such does not cover either Anava or Karman, or Atman or God. These tattvas form, as it were, different coats or vestures of different texture at different times and at different stages, to the soul undergoing evolution with intent to rid itself of its coil, anava, in strict accordance with the law of karma. These form, however, no vestures for the Supreme Being, and he is accordingly addressed as Tattvatita, beyond the tattvas. The soul is also sometimes called so, as lying outside the category of the 36 tattvas, but a distinction has, however, to be made between the two. The soul, a subject, when united to the objective material body, becomes in a sense objective, but the Supreme Subject can never become objective. The enumeration of the tattvas begins with the lowest and grossest, which is the earth, and philosophic enquiry also proceeds, and ought to proceed from the lowest, the things known, to the highest, the unknown. This is the pure inductive method, and when we come to inquire of the manner in which this enquiry has proceeded, we will find that each school holds on to one or another of the tattvas, or something else, as the highest and truest existence, and refuse to recognize that anything else can be real or true. As such, we find Lokayatas, materialists, occupy the lowest rung of the ladder. We say lowest from our standpoint, and we beg their pardon for saying so. In their own estimation, they are postulating the highest possible existence, and every other postulate is only a hoax. The Lokayata will only recognize the first four tattvas, earth, water, fire, and air, and will not recognize even the Akash as a real element. The Buddhists and Jains also recognize only these four elements. If you point to existence of mental powers, the Lokayatas will refer all of them as being merely functions of the brain or other organs of the body, and that all these functions are mere phenomena produced out of and caused by the bodily powers. We proceed a step higher, and we come to those who admit the mental powers to be substance, and would reduce all the bodily functions and powers to mere phenomena, and assert that beyond this mind, buddhi, nothing can there be. If you assert that there is such a thing as an Atman, they will think you are a fool, and if they want, however, to take you in, they will only assert that what we have all along believed in as Atman and God cannot be anything but this buddhi, and they will call this by every name you have learned, to apply to what you regard as higher things. Passing beyond this buddhi, we reach its immediate cause, the mula prakriti. With most Indian theistic schools, they do not carry their notion of matter beyond this mula prakriti. Standing at the head of the first 24 tattvas, they fail to see that matter can assume even finer and more intelligent forms than these 24 tattvas, and as people lower down have mistaken the gross forms as manas, and buddhi itself as soul and God, these higher forms of matter have also been mistaken for soul and God, and the mistake is made more natural, as the souls whose vestures are formed out of these rarer forms of matter are more and more advanced spiritually and intellectually. It will be seen that what is called guna, meaning merely quality, is the special essence of mula prakriti, or matter at this stage, and this guna, which divides itself as sattva, rajas, and tamas, does not pertain to any higher forms of matter than mula prakriti, and this mula prakriti forms the special vesture of the lowest classes of souls called sakala. And these souls range from the greatest gods to the minutest living germ. Each is clothed with the gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. The highest of these classes of souls are clothed with very great powers, and they become the lords of this universe in different manvantaras. And these three beings are Rudra, Vishnu, and Brahma. And having regard to the greatness of these jivas from our own low position, we need not wonder why people have often mistaken these jivas to be the supreme God himself. And a more grosser mistake was never made than when it is foolishly asserted that this Saguna Rudra Jiva is the Pati postulated by the Shaiva Siddhantans. And some of these latter class of people crow over the former and say that the worship of this lower Brahm, Saguna Rudra as Ishvara, is all well for a time, but that is no good and cannot secure any moksha sadhana, and the belief in the Nirguna Brahm is alone capable of freeing one from one's bonds. But that is making very great stock out of the difference between Saguna and Nirguna beings. That this is not in fact any very important factor will be made manifest from the fact that instead of one Nirguna being, as believed in by the Hindu idealists, there are a host of such beings who possess no vestures formed of the three gunas. The higher orders of Pralaya Kalas and Vijnana Kalas are all Nirguna beings, and they can never be born again as mortals or human beings. The Shankyas and Hindu idealists postulate Mula Prakriti and the 24 tattvas derived therefrom, and for a 25th they postulate Jiva, souls, or Atman, when the Atman, Brahm, otherwise Nirguna, becomes clothed with the Saguna body, it becomes a lower Brahm, or Jiva. But when the question is asked how this is possible, some answer honestly that they do not know, and others practice jugglery with words and phrases, and say that there is no such occurrence as the Nirguna Brahm becoming a Jiva, and that if it appears so, it is all a delusion. But the other side argue that if this is not a delusion, but that there is a jiva clothed in darkness, and if the other side would not postulate any being other than the being who falsely appeared as jiva, then the Atma they believe in cannot be the highest, but only one of the lower jivas, and the same mistaken identity is here manifest as in the positions of those who took matter or mind, Buddhi or Indra or Brahma, Vishnu or Rudra as the highest being. Before we pass on, we have to notice one class of Sugunavadins who would not admit that God is Nirguna at all, and who seek to explain away all texts which refer to God as a Nirguna being, by saying that Nirguna simply means absence of bad qualities, and Saguna, presence of good qualities, Sattva. And when one is confronted with a text of the Gita itself, one's highest authority, that God is devoid of all the three gunas, he does not pause to take the plunge that absence of the three gunas does not negate the presence of the sattva guna. There is a wholesale misreading of the texts, and all this quibbling is made necessary simply because they would not brook the idea that the Saguna being, in whose worship they have become such strong adherents, should turn out after all to be not the highest. Next above the Shakalas, Jivas, come the Pralayakalas, who have a special body, Nirguna, formed out of the Tattvas, number 26 to number 30, and it is so distinctive in kind and form and powers that it has been regarded as a separate tattva, almost called Purusha tattva or Atma tattva. This will make clear passages which assert that avyakta, unmanifested prakriti, is greater than Atman, and God is greater than avyatka. Here Atman does not mean soul, but this special Purusha tattva. What this comparative greatness and smallness mean we have explained in our article on Another Side. In explaining the meaning of omnipotence, vibhutva, all that constitutes this Purusha Tattva, it will be noticed, proceeds from Ashuddhamaya, and Ashuddhamaya itself is constituted as the 31st Tattva. Mula Prakriti issues from the 30th Kala. The next five, the highest tattvas, constitute a different body, highly spiritual for the highest order of souls, called Vijnanakalas, and they proceed from Shuddhamaya. The foremost in rank among these Vijnanakalas become lords, Ishvaras of the universe, and they are variously called Maheshvaras, Sadashivas, Bindu, and Nada. These two latter are so nearest God and so potent in their powers that they are almost called Shiva and Shakti, and yet all these seven Ishvaras, three of which are Sagunas, Brahma, Vishnu, Rudra, and four Nirguna, Maheshvara Brahm, Sadashiva Brahm, Bindu Brahm, and Nada Brahm, are all souls united to Asuddha and Suddhamaya bodies. And in the Vedas and Upanishads, all these Saguna and Nirguna gods are spoken of as the highest god, and special Upanishads are devoted to the praise of one or another of these gods. And great confusion arises from the fact that from Rudra, one of the Trinity upwards, all the different Ishvaras are called by all the names of the Most High, Rudra, Shiva, Shankara, Shambho, Bhava, Sharva, Pashupati, etc. The reason for this identity in form and name appears to be that these Ishvaras are in a sense immortal and are not subject to human rebirths as Shakalas, and that there are no possibilities of reversions among them, and they make a much greater approach to the majesty of the Most High than other lower beings. The four avasthas, Jagra, Svapna, Sushupti, and Turiya, are all the conditions attached to the human soul, Sakala, and not to the Pralayakala or Vijnanakala. These latter classes of souls are not themselves subject to these avasthas, which mark the varying and diminishing conditions of the soul's intellectuality. To class God, the Param, as being in the Turiya Avashtha condition is sheer blasphemy. The Siddhanta argues that the being postulated by the Purvapakshin, if he is really in the Turiya Avashtha, cannot be the highest, and that the latter is only mistaking a lower being for the highest. But the term Turiya or Chaturtha is frequently applied to the Supreme, as in the text Shivam, Advaitam, Santam, Chaturtham, but it does not refer there to the Avastha at all, but to the enumeration of the Padarthas, things or person, in special reference to the Trinity, Brahma, Vishnu, Rudra. This essential difference and distinction between the Trinity and the fourth being is so much obliterated by the rise of new sects from time to time, and is so little remembered and understood now, and much less by European writers, that this has been the cause of a lot of unmerited abuse from the hands of unfriendly critics of Hinduism. In the last number of the Christian College magazine, in noticing the life and writings of the Telugu poet Vamana, the writer points out that God is there described as beyond the reach of the Trimurtis, Brahma, Vishnu, and Rudra themselves, and that Vamana describes the highest by such terms as Deva, Paramatma, Brahm, and few others, and that he uses the term Shiva to denote the highest also, and he fails to understand how this can possibly be, when today the term Narayana or Vishnu is used in the whole of the Telugu country as the appellation of the Most High, and he suggests a probable explanation that it might be due to Lingayat influence. But in the days of the author of the Atharvashika Upanishad and the Mahimnat Stotra, not to mention many others which we have quoted at page 36, no Lingayat sect had come into being, and yet their belief is exactly similar to that of Vimana. The brief survey we have taken of the tattvas will show what great force and real meaning there is in the text we have quoted at the head of our article. The inquirer, as he proceeds from the knowledge of the visible to that of invisible powers in nature and in man, and ascends to higher and higher knowledge, rejects the lower knowledge as not this, and transcending the manifested and unmanifested of Yatka, both Maya and Atma, knows the one God in every Bhuta hid, pervading all, the inner Atma of every Atma, inspector of all deeds, in whom everything dwells, the support, the witness, pure intelligence, and Nirguna being. Him, the Ishvara of Ishvaras, the Maheshvara, the God supreme of gods, the King of kings, the supreme of the supreme, the Isha of the universe, the eternal of eternals, the intelligence of every intelligence, who the one of many the desires dispenses, knowing that cause, the God to be approached by Sankhya and Yoga, etc., and him having adored the mortal from all pasha bonds is free. We have referred to Saguna and Nirguna beings, and these are often translated as personal and impersonal beings, but the renderings are not perfectly accurate, and the usage of all these four terms are frequently very loose, and we hope to devote a separate paper for the definition and distinction of these terms. The nature of the Divine Personality. Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam, Brahma, Taittiriya Upanishad 2.1. Bliss is Brahman. Taittiriya Upanishad 3.6. There is one Rudra only, they do not allow a second, who rules all the words by his powers. Atharva Shirastra. God is love. We begin where we left off in our last, and in discussing the nature of Saguna and Nirguna God, we will discuss the article of the Reverend Father Bartoli on God, a Personal Being, which appeared in our last two issues, and the editorial God and the Brahman of the Brahmavadin of 16th Ultimo, and the lecture of Swami Vivekananda published in the last November number of the same magazine. These two parties occupy positions which seem almost distant as the poles and altogether irreconcilable. The Reverend Father asks, why this mockery? Say with the fool that there is no God, that the existence of God is a sham, a bubble, a false show, a cheat, a daydream, a chimera, because an impersonal God is all this. The learned Swami, on the other hand, says, the monistic theory has this merit that it is the nearest to a demonstrable truth in theology we can get. The idea that the impersonal being is in nature, and that nature is the evolution of that impersonal, is the nearest that we can get to any truth that is demonstrable, and every conception of God which is partial and little and personal is comparatively not rational. In the editorial note on God and Brahman, a novel and a very presumptuous and misleading distinction in the use of the words God and Brahman is attempted, and the article concludes by saying that the worship of God, in all truth and in all love, will never lead one to moksha. God is for such, and the Brahman is for those whose goal is perfect rest in perfect freedom. The presumption is in supposing that all other religionists, except those of our learned brother's ilk, do not postulate a Brahman, and that their path, not being the Soham path Paramahamsa, will not lead one to moksha, and it is also an unwarranted presumption in trying to restrict the use of the word God to what these people were till now calling the lower Brahman, or Saguna Brahman, or personal God. The so-called Vedantists have an insidious way of recommending themselves to the favor of other people by bestowing judiciously a panegyric here and a panegyric there, and at the same time they try to raise themselves above the shoulders of these others, and at the latter's expense. They profess to be full of the milk of human kindness to professors of all creeds and sects, and would willingly take them under their folds. What for? Only so that these people may see that what they profess to teach is the only true path containing the only truth, and that the other paths are, well, only no paths at all, only it will bring them to the same point of birth and death, containing a so-called a phenomenal truth. And then what is the truth of these people worth after all? In itself it is so shaky, or they maul it so badly in their attempt to please everybody, that their truth, substance, becomes indistinguishable from untruth, phenomena. And this is exactly what the Swami's Guru, the Paramahamsa, the Mahatman says. God, the Saguna, the personal God, is Maya and Shakti, indistinguishable as heat from fire, and this God or Maya is as such one with Brahman. And so the distinction of personal and impersonal God is a distinction without a difference. Prabhupada Bharata, page 109. It will be seen from a reading of the Reverend Father's article and from how these words are used in the Brahmavadin and the Prabhupada Bharata that all these parties use the word Saguna as fully equivalent to personal and Nirguna as equivalent to impersonal being. And a shade has never crossed these people's minds whether such rendering is quite the truth. In our last we quoted a Svetasvatara mantra in which the one God is called Nirguna. Today we quote a Gita verse in which God is called Nirguna. Beginningless, without qualities, Nirguna, the Supreme Self, Paramatman, imperishable, though seated in the body, Okantaya, worketh not nor is soiled. And the work of chapters 13 and 14 have to be read to know the precise meanings of guna, saguna, and nirguna. Verses 5 to 18, chapter 14, define and describe the gunas and their varieties, sattva, rajas, and tamas. The three gunas are prakriti born, from which are all actions, causes, and effects, and from where all bodies produced. Sattva is simply bodily and mental purity, leading one to the desire of wisdom and bliss. Wisdom light streameth forth from the sattvic man, and when he dies he goes to the worlds of the gods, Vijnana Loka, and he rises upwards. The sattvic man is still clothed in the material, prakritic body, and is not yet released from his bonds, not a mukta. He is simply what the world esteems as a wise and great man. On the other hand, Rajas engenders passion, engenders thirst for life, and is united to action, greed, outgoing energy, undertaking of actions, restlessness, desire, and he is again and again born among people attached to action. Tamas engenders ignorance, delusion, sloth, indolence, darkness, negligence, etc., and he is born and enveloped in the vilest qualities. From this Prakriti and the three gunas born of Prakriti is distinguished the Purusha. Prakriti is the cause of causes and effects and instruments, and Purusha is the origin of pleasure and pain, i.e. experiences, and is attached to the qualities guna born of prakriti, and by this attachment or pasha undergoes birth and death. So the reason for its undergoing birth and death is its attachment to the gunas, sattva included, and the only way this Purusha, or Brahmavadin's Brahman, the dweller in the body, can be freed from death unto everlasting life is by crossing over the three gunas, and by realizing that all action and change is the result of the three gunas, and that he himself, Purusha, is actionless or flawless, and that there is one higher than the three gunas, Prakriti, other than himself, the highest Purusha, the Paramatman, he who pervadeth and sustaineth the three worlds, the indestructible Ishvara, the spectator and permitter, supporter, enjoyer, the Maheshvara. And this beginningless Nirguna Paramatman cannot perish, though he is also seated in the body, as the Purusha or Atma is seated, and is not attached to the three gunas, of which the bodies are created, and is not tainted nor soiled, as the Purusha was declared to be in verse 19 and 21 of the 13th chapter. Just as Akasha is not soiled, though present in each and every thing, the Purusha, the Brahmavadin's Brahman, and our Jivatma, has also to realize, for effecting his freedom, that he and Prakriti are all rooted in this one and proceed from it. And though the one is neither rooted in Prakriti nor Purusha, being their efficient cause, this one God, the Svetasvatara says, the passage will bear repetition, is hid in every Bhuta, pervading all, the inner Atma of every Atma, inspector of all deeds, spectator, in whom everything dwells, the support, the witness, the pure intelligence and nirguna being, the Ishvara of Ishvaras, the Maheshvara, the God Supreme of gods, the King of kings, the Supreme of the Supreme, the Isha of the universe, the Eternal of eternals, the consciousness which every being's consciousness contains, who, one of many, the desires dispenses, the cause. There shines not the sun, nor moon, and stars, nor do these lightnings shine, much less this fire. When he shines forth, all things shine after him. By Brahman shining, shines all here below. This same being is described below as the all-creator and protector, the refuge of all, who created Brahma himself and taught him his craft. This same being is described by the Taittiriya Upanishad as the only true and endless intelligence, whose head is surely love, joy his right wing, delight his left, bliss his very self, and who is other than the Atman, who we know to be also Sat, Chit, and Ananda. The Gita expressly speaks of God as being other than Purusha and Prakriti. The Svetasvatara also does the same. The Vedanta Sutras sum up the teaching of the Upanishads beyond all doubt in Sutras 17 and 21 of first pada of first chapter, and in the preceding sutras, God is described as love, intelligence, the inside of, antas, of everything, the light, the person, the powerful one. It is of him, it is said by the Mundaka, that he perceives all, knows all, whose penance consists of knowledge, of whom the Svetasvatara and Gita speak, of having hands and feet on all sides, eyes and faces on all sides. Now this is the God who is described as the creator, protector, and destroyer, and the refuge, the truth, the intelligence, and love and bliss, who is described as the supporter, spectator, seer, and person, and who is declared at the same time to be Nirguna, transcending both Prakriti and Purusha, and gods and Ishvaras. Now we will ask our Reverend Father Bartoli if he will accept this Nirguna being as the true God, or the Saguna God, or Ishvara, the lower one referred to in Mantra 7, Section 6 of Svetasvatara, whom we showed in our table as forming the Sakala Jivas, and in fact the personal God whom our learned contributor defines and describes is in fact none other than this Nirguna being. The Christian ideal of God is also that he is the creator of heaven and earth, the only one truth and light and intelligence and changeless substance, who loves and cherishes his creatures, and who is the bridge to immortality, and who is different from his creatures. The personal God of the Christian theology does not mean a being who undergoes change, is clothed in a material body as ourselves, who is born and dies, though they speak of one incarnation, or or all those ever and anon, who has eyes, hereafter senses as we have, and whose intelligence and will and purvey is finite and limited as ours. Of course, we have the proposition also that we do not agree with those who falsely suppose that the Nirguna being, even such Chidananda, cannot be predicated. If so, where is the being itself, and what remains of it at all? And all our Reverend Father's denunciations on the impersonal God will apply even with greater force, that it is not knowledge, consciousness, and power, jnana, Kriyasvarupam, and that it is not the author of creation and destruction and grace, and that this Nirguna God can neither know and love us, nor can we love and know him either. All these and more are no doubt stated as an article of faith by the so-called Vedantists, but the editor of the Light of the East, a staunch Vedantist, ranks them as gross materialists and atheists, and we have quoted direct texts to show otherwise. Some of these so-called Vedantists also claim to have reached the knowledge of the highest by merely learning to speak of God in the neuter as it, that, and Brahman, and by regarding him as formless and nameless. Nothing can be a greater delusion than this. This it of theirs is nothing but Jiva, after all, and one with the universe. Says the Swami, so the whole is the Absolute, but within it every article is in a constant state of flux and change, unchangeable and changeable at the same time, impersonal and personal in one. This is our conception of the universe, of motion and of God, and this is what is meant by thou art that. This may be what the Swami holds as true, but this is what we hold to be Pasha and Pashajnanam, materialism and anthropomorphism. The Swami glibly enough talks of the Absolute and its particles and the unchangeable and changeable Brahman, but did he forget the Vedic mantra that God is partless, actionless, and tranquil? And the Swami's Guru fitly enough talks of Maya and Brahman as one. And what is materialism, pray? And then what is this much vaunted attribute of Achala and Nischala, unchangeability, worth, when its every particle is undergoing change? Man is seated and at perfect rest, yet so many of his muscles and nerves are in the utmost active condition, and undergoing change and destruction, and the particles of his whole body are also undergoing change, destruction, and reconstruction, and his thoughts may wander and create waste in the animal tissues. A pool of water may be at perfect rest, but a single breath of wind can cause motion in every particle, and we do not call water a stable element, and we do not aspire ourselves to the condition of rest and freedom described above. This is only a make-believe rest and stability. So we must rate the Brahman, unchangeable and changing, of the Swami as only a being. Every Chalana being undergoes rest at short or long intervals out of sheer exhaustion, willful, inconstant, and unstable, the mere toy of every passing whim, every passing breath. The infinite and limitless God, whom the Brahmavadin portrays in such glowing colors to mislead the credulous few, whose throne is space, and whose queen is time, and who is limitless and infinite as space and time are limitless, must also share a similar ignoble fate. We never thought that we would have to correct our learned brother in regard to such a simple thing as that the very notion of time and space implies both limitation and finiteness. We have no need to turn over big treatises to find authorities for this statement. There is lying before us a small and well-written pamphlet of Dr. Peebles of America entitled The Soul. In the very opening paragraph we find the following lines. We quote it only to what a trite notion it has now become. All beginnings in show, time, and space necessarily have their endings. A creature which has its beginning in time is incapable of perpetuating itself or being perpetuated through eternity. A line projected from a point in space has a further limit which no logic can carry to infinity. We have on another occasion pointed out that infinite space and limitless time are contradictions in words. The Absolute can never involve itself in space and time, time. If it does, there is no use of calling it the absolute and unconditioned, and our brother is quite right in saying that knowledge of this Brahman is only a misnomer, a myth we should say. Then again, in the same page, 587, our brother says that the Brahman, it, is formless, for all forms imply a boundary. Vainest of delusions, but does formlessness imply no boundary? So many things in nature are invisible and have no form. If by formless is meant unextended, such as mind, etc., we know mind as a product of Maya is also limited, but by formless they generally mean arupi, invisible, and invisibility is no great attribute after all, as matter can also be formless and invisible. We have elsewhere pointed out the mistake of taking form and formless as being respectively equivalent to personal and impersonal. To deny to God that he can take form is to deny his omnipotence and limit his nature. The distinction is from our standpoint. When we begin to identify him with anything we know, from the lowest tattva to ourselves, Atma, then this is anthropomorphic. The distinction does not rest on calling the Supreme as Shiva or Shivam, he, she, or it. God has form. The Shrutis declare so. God is formless, so also the Shrutis say. He has form and has no form. This is because his body is not formed of matter, but is pure cheat or intelligence. It is when we make God enter a material body and say that he is born and dies, then it is we who blaspheme him and humanize him, and our conception becomes anthropomorphic. Some of the so-called Vedantists who are unable to distinguish between what constitutes God's real nature and anthropomorphism and Hindu symbolism mistake the ideal of God according to Saiva Siddhanta. Do they care to understand why, when describing God, they say he is neither male nor female, nor neuter, neither he, she, nor it, neither rupi, arupi, nor ruparupi, and yet when they address God, he is called Shiva, Shiva, or Shivam, Rupam, Krishna, Pingalam, and worshipped as the invisible air and Akash? Professor Max Mueller points out how, with bewildering perplexity, the gender varies frequently from the masculine to the neuter in the Svetasvatara. Well, in the passage, it has feet and hands everywhere. If the neuter Brahman can have feet, why could not the being with the feet, etc., be described as he also? We describe all inanimate creation as it, and when we proceed to call the Supreme as it also, we transcend from Saguna to Nirguna. We have already cautioned against mistaking the Shakti of Shaiva Siddhanta to be Maya. It is this mistake that has been the fruitful source of all the degradation and vice of the northern Vamachara. This Shakti is called most frequently in Tamil Aral Shakti, God's manifestation as love or grace, and the greatest of this, Aral, is thus beautifully described by Tirumular. Who knows the power of this Aral by which omnipresence is secured? Who understands that this love transmuted herself into tasteful ambrosia? Who thinks that this love permeates subtly the five great operations, Panchakritya? Who knows that this love has eyes on all sides, is omniscient? Born in love, bred up in love, changing and resting in love, fed in the supreme ambrosia like love, the Nandi entered me as love. He says elsewhere that none knows that love and God are the same. To go and identify this supreme love of God, which like the emerald covers everything with her own love, and imparts to each and every one its own peculiar beauty and power and grace and will, to Maya, which like darkness plunges everything into ignorance and death, is real blasphemy and prostitution indeed. We will stop here the discussion so far as Saguna and Nirguna is concerned, and glance at the controversy as regards personal and impersonal God. It is not very easy to get at the precise definition of these terms, and the quarrel seems to be more often a quarrel over words. One author, for instance, says that by personality is implied and involved mortality, corporeality, material, human volitionality. Another says that personality involves limitation, Is this so, and is this the proper connotation and denotation of the word? If so, nobody need pause that God cannot be personal, but eminent men like Emerson and others say that it does not mean any such thing. To quote again Dr. Peebles, personality in its common and outward acceptation is usually associated with appearance and outward character, but to such writers as Emerson, James Freeman Clarke, Froschhammer, Elisha Mulford, Lotz, etc., personality has a far deeper meaning. The Latins used persona to signify personating, counterfeiting, or wearing a mask, but personality, in the sense in which Emerson employs it, signifies true being, both concrete and spiritual. It alone is original being. It is not limited. Personality is that universal element that pervades every human soul, and which is at once its continent and fount of being. Distinction from others and limitations by them results from individuality, not personality. Personality therefore pertains to the substance of the soul, and individuality to its form. And the Reverend J. Iverach also controverts very ably in his work, Is God Knowable?, the idea of personality as at first stated, and argues that to say that the absolute and the unconditioned being is personal is not a contradiction in terms, such as a round square, but that it will be true as when we say a white or crimson square. When we speak of the absolute, we speak of it as a predicate of pure being, and what we mean simply is that the absolute is complete in itself. It has no conditions save the conditions contained in itself. When we speak of personality, we ascribe to it being, regarded as pure spiritual being, and we simply mean that absolute personal being is and must be self-conscious, rational, and ethical, must answer to the idea of spirit. Why may not the absolute being be self-conscious? To deny this to him would be to deny to him one of the perfections which even finite beings may have, said Saint Mikandardeva, when asked the same question several centuries before, Shivajnana Bodham 11, Sutra 1b, and our Saint Tirumalar also states the question in similar terms. That day I knew my God, the same was not understood by the Devas. The bright effulgence lighting inside my body and soul, it is said, does not know. Who else can know them? We will stop here for the present. We accept the view of personality as set forth by Emerson and others, in which case we must reject the notion of an impersonal, unintelligent, and unconscious, unknown, unknowable, unlovable, and unloving nothing. The Christians and Mohammedans, there are some Sagunavatis among them also, have no need to fall shy of the Nirguna conception, though the Ramanujas and the Madhvas, whose God being identified with Prakriti itself, Vasudeva para Prakriti, never rise above the Saguna Sattvic conception. Some of the Vedantists, halting between two stools, contrive to fall most miserably, and their view of a God, both Nirguna and Saguna, personal and impersonal, is what we have no good language to describe. None need be ashamed to proclaim truth if it is truth. Why undertake to trouble of praising Krishna and his teaching to the skies, to say, after all, that Krishna, the late Mr. T. Subbarao stated more plainly that he cannot be the incarnation of the Absolute, is only for such who wish to be born again and again, and who consider the service of God as their highest felicity, and Brahman is for those whose goal is perfect rest and freedom. These very people will raise a howl if the Saiva were to state the same truth, which by the way was stated long ago by Sri Krishna himself, that worship of Shiva or Shivam alone would secure Sayujya, moksha, and the worship of other gods, Ishvara, Brahma, Vishnu, Rudra, etc., would only secure their respective worlds, pada. There are some more questions which arise out of this discussion, and we reserve them for a future occasion.